the Honorable Tun Abdullah, His Highness Tunku Ali, the Honorable Minister Dr. Koh, Honorable Ministers and dignitaries, Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar and members of the Khazanah National Board, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great honor and privilege for me to deliver the 10th Khazanah Global Lectures to such a distinguished audience. Also, it's a great treat for my wife Julia and I to be back in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, one of our favorite places in the world, and to see so many old friends. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be in such a gathering. Now, I note that the speakers before me included presidents, prime ministers, Nobel laureates, and global leaders who have made outstanding contributions to economic, corporate, and social development and to nation building. I certainly do not belong to that group. I will really try my best, however, to not disappoint you this evening with my remarks. 2012 has been a year of monumental change globally and regionally. Leadership changes in the United States and in China has just been confirmed only this month. Whilst the Korean and Japanese elections, of course, will be held before the end of the year. Each government comes into office recognizing the enormity of economic challenges to be addressed. So it may be fitting, as the year draws to a close, to talk about how the global economy is evolving. Specifically, I would like to talk about an area that I have studied and have a great interest in, which has, I think, also a great impact on the global economy. That is the evolution of the global supply chains, and I will also touch on the challenges for Asia. I would like to address 4 points tonight: the new global order, the changes to global supply chains, the impact of these changes on Asia, and then the challenges and the future outlooks for the global supply chains. Firstly, on the new global order. The global financial crisis of 2008 signaled a major turning point in the world global order, moving away from the G7 domination towards a more balanced, representative leadership under the G20. Most people think that this rebalancing is due to the emergence of China, but we must take a longer view. Not far behind the 1.3 billion Chinese are the 1.2 billion Indians, the 1.6 billion Muslims, and by the end of this century, 2 billion Africans. The new global order will see the emerging markets moving into middle-class incomes and becoming highly urbanized and benefiting from a remarkable technological revolution. The United Nations predicts that the population of advanced economies is likely to shrink and age rapidly in the second half of this century, accompanied by heavy healthcare and pension burdens and rising government deficits. On the other hand, a recent ADB, Asian Development Bank study on Asia 2050, suggested that Asia will grow to account for half of the world's GDP and possess half of the global financial wealth by 2050. This optimistic view of Asian prospects must, of course, be tempered with a view of the many risks. Competition for scarce resources, growing social inequalities, natural disasters, terrorism, and geopolitical conflicts. Indeed, the global order is changing very rapidly. Put simply, we are on a journey with no precedents and for which the moral and intellectual compasses that we have may not really be the best ones for the tasks ahead. As Asia plays a greater role in global growth and transformation, it will be called upon to shoulder more responsibility for our global commons: peace, prosperity, and environmental sustainability. These responsibilities and issues are more complex than we can imagine. So last year, my brother William and I founded the Fung Global Institute, an independent, non-profit think tank based in Hong Kong, to bring together thought leaders, industry experts, and researchers to study these key global issues from Asian perspectives. Notice that I use the word perspectives in the plural, because Asia, in my mind, is not a unitary whole, but a mosaic of cultural, historical, and even civilizational diversity. The Fung Global Institute has been created not only to bring diverse Asian voices into the global debate and vice versa, but also to bring business perspectives into the policy dialogue, because we firmly believe that sound economics is a necessary part of social stability. Our 4 areas of initial study are global supply chains, the future of finance in Asia, the evolving growth models, and Asia's sustainable development. Simply put, global supply chains represent the real economy, finance the virtual economy, managed by the governance model, and our natural environment is our resource constraint. As the new economic model of Malaysia has articulated, we need to take care of prosperity for our people, social justice and equity, and our natural environment. Our methodology is to study these 4 projects in parts and then integrate them into a holistic framework that helps frame the issues by which Asia can develop in the 21st century with stability, sustainability, and social inclusiveness. This evening, I would like to discuss the evolution of global supply chains to show how profoundly the real sector is evolving and how challenging it has become to adapt to these new challenges. As one member of the Fung Global Institute's Academic Council, Lord Nicholas Stern, which I'm sure many of you know, he said recently, there is a new industrial revolution going on as a result of advances in green technology and greater social awareness of the environment. These new social trends and technology have also revolutionized the development options and business models for countries like Malaysia. Now, let me talk a little bit about the evolving global supply chains. Supply chains are the interlinked processes which enable the production, distribution, and retail of goods to the end consumer. 60 years ago, most consumer products were actually produced in a single country by a single, perhaps vertically integrated company, and then shipped by a single agent to its destination to be consumed. Over the past 3 decades, I have witnessed the creation and transformation of global supply chains, particularly here in Asia. 4 broad stages are evident. In the 1960s and the 1970s, multinational companies began to move the labor-intensive stages of manufacturing to low-wage countries in Asia, first in the 4 dragons that many of you remember, then the 4 tigers. Malaysia was the prime example of an economy which benefited from outsourcing in the electronics industry. For the recipient countries, offshoring brought technology transfer, employment creation, and upgrading of skills, which would then become, of course, the building blocks of indigenous industry in the future. From the mid-1980s, the ICT revolution had made it possible for some production stages previously performed really in close proximity to be dispersed geographically before being brought back together in a single location for final assembly. The whole process was orchestrated by technology and enabled by improvements in logistics and transportation. From the mid-1990s, Asia's participation in global supply chains rose sharply on the back of China's growth and favorable policy frameworks. Thus, we have seen China's share of global manufacturing exports rise from around 2% in the year 2000 to 13% in 2011. But let's be clear about China's role. Today's products may have their final assembly in China, but they really comprise components and inputs from many different countries. What is commonly called made in China is in actuality made in the world. even if our trade statistics, in my mind, have yet to catch up. They don't really quite reflect that situation. Finally, in the past few years, as wages began to rise in China and other countries in Southeast Asia became more open to international trade, various parts of the production process were moved to low-wage economies like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia. In short, the rise of global supply chains has created a very strong sense of global interconnectedness and interdependence, which are very important from both policy and business perspectives. Two recent events highlight how this global interdependence has begun to affect business and policy in the real world. First, I'd like to refer you to the global financial crisis, which caused banks to cut back their lending, which put severe strain on the trade finance. During the 2008 Lehman crisis, trade finance was reduced by 10 to 15%, even though it was short-term and carried low risk. And this was, of course, accompanied by a fall of nearly 20% in physical trade volume in Asia. While some of this trade decline was due to shrinking demand, the lack of availability of trade finance certainly exacerbated the situation. The lenders may have been headquartered in New York, London, or Paris, but the consequences of lending cutbacks were acutely felt in Asia. Secondly, the catastrophic earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster that hit Japan in March of last year, plus the Bangkok floods in July, disrupted the production of critical components for many global supply chains. We learned that highly efficient, tightly wound supply chains were susceptible to high network risks. What we really saw is as the efficiencies got screwed down tighter and tighter over time on these supply chains, when you get an external shock, the whole thing fell apart. So therefore, we really need to rethink how to protect against the weakest links, concentration risks, and the possibility of supply chain disruption. And it was nothing like these two disasters to really hit home. Now, let me explore for a moment the impact of these global supply chain trends on Asia itself. The evolution of global supply chains is a story of changing geography and network orchestration. And I've been lucky to witness this through Hong Kong's own development. In the pioneering years up to 1949, Hong Kong was the main entrepôt, serving the mainland of China. In 1949, though, with the influx of refugees, entrepreneurs, and bankers from Shanghai, Hong Kong began to develop as a manufacturing base, producing consumer products like plastic flowers and small transistor radios, basically low-end consumer products. China's opening up to the outside world in 1979 coincided with Hong Kong's need to reinvent itself as its cost of doing business rose. Hong Kong risked pricing itself out of the market for mass production. When Mr. Deng Xiaoping created the Shanshan Special Economic Zone next door to Hong Kong, a solution became evident. Hong Kong rationalized its production into southern China. And I use the word rationalize because what we did was to retain the high value-added front end and the back end in Hong Kong and move the labor-intensive middle portion across the border into southern China. The front end, of course, included product design, engineering, and marketing, and things like that. The back end was the logistics, the quality control, the financing, and the distribution that distributed the products worldwide. This combination was so powerful that the Pearl River Delta became a major manufacturing base that supported China's development. At its peak, the PRD, the Pearl River Delta, accounted for almost 30% of China's total exports and 11% of China's GDP. This model, successfully developed in the south in the Pearl River Delta, then really moved up the coast to the Yangtze River Delta around Shanghai, and then to the northern region, the Bohai region around Beijing, which of course is also close to Korea and Japan. Let me just perhaps elaborate just a little bit and talk to you a little bit about the impact of what this whole model has meant for manufacturing in the world. You see, before this whole revolution started with the developments that I mentioned with Shenzhen in Hong Kong, in the way manufacturing was done previously, everything was really manufactured very often by one factory in one country. And then it was shipped to another country to be consumed. So the value added, in a sense, was very clear. It's in one country and very often in one factory. Now, with this model of actually taking the manufacturing process and taking segments of that and placing it with different factories, in fact, in different countries, what you've done is disperse the whole manufacturing process. Every piece is going to the best in class. And what really you're doing is actually taking the value added and spreading it over a number of factories and a number of countries. Now, the thing that holds all this together are really two very important enablers. The first is IT, information technology, especially the internet. So with the advent of the internet, when you manage these global supply chains and start dispersing this manufacturing, you're able to keep track of the bits and pieces all around the world. The second important enabler was what I would call the start of the modern logistics. The idea that you're able to very quickly get products from here to there, just in time. And these two enablers is what really enable this whole phenomenon to take place. So really what we have seen is, compared to the old model, over the last 30 years, because of these development of the supply chains, you have completely changed the way manufacturing is done. It is no longer a single activity, perhaps by a vertically integrated factory in one country and then shipped abroad, but it's actually a dispersed manufacturing process. Now, the impact of this is very significant, because if you take the manufacturing process and take the different stages and start dispersing them, the atomization, if you would, of the supply chain, you're able actually to allow a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, to participate in pieces of this process. Whereas before, they had to really do the whole thing, the whole vertical, before they're able to compete globally. Now, when you actually disperse each piece and have the SMEs concentrate on a niche and do well in that niche, the SME is able to move overseas and participate in the global supply chains much earlier than they would otherwise. In fact, the whole thing becomes a game of what I would call niche hunting. You develop as an SME a particular niche, and you fit into this supply chain over here, then you look for which other supply chain where you can use this particular skill. See, if you contrast this with if the world had developed totally differently, let's say it went in the other direction of vertical integration, what would we see today? We would see a smaller and smaller number of huge conglomerates, all vertically integrated, and much to the exclusion of the SMEs. And I think this development over the last 30 years is really the thing that has driven global trade, the thing that has allowed SMEs to participate in global trade much earlier than they would otherwise. And also, it's allowed the development of many countries in the early stages of development. Of course, so what I'm really saying is this atomization, this breaking up, this dispersal of the manufacturing process really has resulted in the opening up or the democratization of the entire process. And that, in my mind, has really resulted in the growth of the SMEs, which, as we all know, are the people that really provides the jobs and the job opportunities in all over the world. So it's, I just want to point out the significance of this development. And this development could only have happened because we had the internet revolution and also the logistics, the modern logistics. These two enablers allow this whole phenomenon to happen. So this has irreversibly changed the whole way manufacturing is done around the world. And we're now seeing the consequence of that. What we believe is that this really is the way the whole a real economy in the world, if you look underneath the aggregate figures, that's how the world actually is working. In fact, the Development of the supply chains determine obviously where the goods flow. It also determines where the FDI goes, because as we all know, FDI goes hand in hand also with the trade. And very importantly, it allocates work. It determines where the jobs flow. And not only jobs, but the level of the skill, the level of the jobs. And it's like taking out the hood and looking at the engine. And the engine of the real economy are indeed these supply chains. And they are the people at the micro level that is really making, in the aggregate, driving the whole global economy. Now, of course, I'd like to just say, before I leave this area, the government obviously has an important role to play, and I'll say a lot more about this in a bit later on. It must make sure that the infrastructure in an economy, especially in the IT area and also in the logistics area, is developed to an extent that will allow the local SMEs to at least latch onto the lowest rung of the ladder. Unless the government enables the IT infrastructure and the logistics infrastructure to do that, then there's no way for the SMEs to participate in that global economy. So once you're onto the lowest rung of the ladder, then it's up to you to actually keep on climbing. The final thing I would emphasize before I go on is once you start thinking about this whole idea of dispersing the manufacturing and taking pieces of it to different factories, what you're really doing is not competing a company to a company. If you think about it, it's a group of companies against a group of companies. So really, what you need is the skills to orchestrate entire supply chains that compete with each other. If I look at two retailers across the street competing with each other, what I see is not just two retailers. I see a huge, long supply chain behind this retailer and a long supply chain behind the other retailer, and it's team against team. So no longer to be successful in this environment, can you be just a good player by yourself? It's not a one-man game. It's like playing a soccer match. You can be a very good player, but if your team doesn't work together, the 10 other people, the team, you're going to be beaten by another team that actually works together. It's supply chain against supply chain. It's really, so the whole skill base is not just doing your own thing in a particular niche, but to be able to organize and orchestrate the whole team in a team effort against each other. If you lose at the end, okay, the whole team loses. And so that really is the point I want to get across. And the whole concept now is moving towards orchestration of these global supply chains that consist of diverse members and factories from many economies around the world. You know, one final point I would make is the following. If you look at the trade statistics for Asia, the intra-Asia trade numbers have been going up dramatically. Now, a lot of people say, oh, that is evidence of that Asia is actually could be dissociated from the global economy. But actually not true, because what you really see when you dig into the numbers, what's being shipped around Asia are actually components and semi-finished goods. To be finished, perhaps in a country like China or elsewhere, and eventually to be shipped to the West mostly to satisfy the consumption which is still in the West. So that also accounts for a lot of the growth in trade, in intra-regional trade, which is because of this phenomenon that I've just described, that people are actually taking different parts of the supply chain and sectioning it and putting it in different factories in different countries so that the goods actually get shipped around before it's finally finished. So I wanted to really make sure that I get this particular point across. Now, before I leave this section, you might ask, okay, what is the next frontier for the global supply chains? Now, I would say a very good example is what perhaps Hong Kong has gone through, and again, I will use Hong Kong as an example. In the last 4 decades, Hong Kong, since 1979, has transformed itself from a manufacturing economy really into a services-based economy. Today, manufacturing comprises less than 2% of Hong Kong's GDP, while services actually comprise over 92%. So it's become a very service-intense economy. But it actually stands to reason, because what has happened is, if you think of Hong Kong as being a manufacturing base when we started in 1979, and when you start moving the labor-intensive middle portion out, and you are left with the front end and the back end, which are essentially services, then the whole economy is transforming itself over time to just a services-intensive economy. And that really is, in a sense, the model of the future. What we're really now saying is that the supply chains are actually moving from thinking about just production into thinking about services. How the services could be also taken into segments that could be done best at different places. And the fragmentation of the services supply chain, I think, will be the next big wave. In fact, you might say, if you look at Hong Kong, Hong Kong has 93% of GDP from services, very service-intensive economy. By the way, it's very unusual also from the standpoint that it's not consumer services, it's what we call producer service oriented, because it's business-to-business services. But if you look at the Chinese mainland, actually 43% of the GDP comes from services, which is very low. And in the current 12 5-year plan in China, the idea is to move that to 47% over a 5-year period. So, in fact, the 47% is actually very low for even a developing economy. Most developing economies will actually have over 60% of its GDP from services. So the very simple way to put the future transformation of Hong Kong and the global supply chains is really for Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland now, for the next period of development, to actually develop a synergistic model which allows Hong Kong's very service-intense base to be actually, in a sense, working in coordination with the mainland, so that the opportunity of actually, in a sense, sharing a part of the work with the mainland in the services supply chains, and what to serve, what to actually share and what to keep, I think will be the model that will be developing over time. So if you step back and look at the situation, I would say that the global supply chains is going to be moving in the business world to serve to supply chains that actually deal with the movement of services. Okay, let me now look at the future challenges and the outlook for global supply chains. My retelling of recent history hopefully impresses upon you that supply chains have undergone great change. In my view, the future may be even more interesting. I believe that we're at a major inflection point with regard to supply chains, particularly in Asia. I see at least 4 major forces whose convergence sets the stage for a generational transformation of global supply chains. First, the Asian economies are beginning to shift growth from exports as the key growth driver towards domestic investment and consumption. Part of this is a natural progression of economies moving towards middle income status. It is further supported by policies from governments who recognize that domestic demand offers a stabilizing complement to the turbulence of global markets. This means that there are huge opportunities for global producers able to supply rising consumer demand from China, India, ASEAN, and other emerging markets. So this rebalancing of a lot of the growth economies from emphasizing exports to emphasizing domestic consumption is going to create a major shift in the way people look at these global supply chains. Secondly, through the internet, consumers today have greater access to information about products and how they are made. This has created a new awareness in consumers about the environment, social issues, and sustainability. Sustainability strategies are new dimensions that global companies must now learn to manage. And this is a very important phenomenon. When we look at sustainability, not only is it the right thing to do, the good thing to do for any company, but it's actually good business. Because what we're seeing now is a very strong desire by the consumer, especially in the Western economies, to actually, in my mind, have a broader definition of quality. Quality no longer is, let's say we look at this cup, it's no longer what you see in front of you in terms of the product attributes and the prices. It's what you don't see also. In the process of producing this cup, what have you done to the environment? And that actually invisible aspect is now becoming more and more important to the consumer. And in my mind, that actually defines a new concept of quality that is driven by the market, and that will apply pressure all the way up the supply chain. And everybody in the supply chain will respond because that's what the market needs. Thirdly, technology will have a huge impact on the supply chains in terms of jobs. We all know the growth of robotics. Robots may soon be prominent in the production of consumer products, even in China, and of course, elsewhere. A new technology, 3D printing, I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, is also maturing, making it possible to locate production ever closer to the consumer. Such technology will create new jobs and industries, but will also render some jobs and companies redundant. These dislocations should be addressed sooner rather than later and point to a key role of government. Fourthly, changes in world trade are also impacting supply chains. As someone who believes that there is no substitute for a strong multilateral system, I have to admit that in recent years, the world has settled for second best. Here I'm referring to the proliferation of free trade agreements, FTAs, and bilateral agreements that are already altering the world trade landscape. The analogy some people use is that every bilateral deal that is done removes a brick from the multilateral world. When you remove a few bricks, it's okay, the wall is still there. But eventually, when you do this enough, the whole wall falls down. And I think that is very much to the detriment of all of us. This will absolutely actually have a major impact on the way that we're now doing the supply chains and so on. Let me give you a very good example. If there is a proliferation of bilaterals, there will be a huge increase in the cost of doing trade. The reason is very simple. Every bilateral deal have a different definition of country of origin and will be subject to different rules. So when you produce a product, the same product, if you ship to country A or if you ship to country B and country C, they're all under different rules. One may qualify as a country of origin in this country, but another may not qualify because the country of origin rules are different. So for companies doing business globally, it's no longer the way it is today. You know, country of origin is defined by a multilateral system that everybody accepts. And the cost of doing business will rise. And in my mind, again, much to the detriment of the SMEs. Because maybe the larger companies can afford the infrastructure to handle all this complexity, but certainly not the small companies. And let me remind everybody again, as we all know, the job creators are actually in the SME sector. So I think there are really very dark clouds in the way the multilateral trading system is now being eroded by this proliferation of bilateral trade deals, the FTAs. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me just perhaps explore with you what are the policy implications for these major changes on the evolution in the global supply chain, and perhaps, you know, for a country like Malaysia. For business, companies will have to be nimble, flexible, and innovative, given the rapidly changing environment. But even as business seeks to adjust, the global competition in supply chain and networks require governments to respond in terms of reorganizing government structures, streamlining regulations, improving speed of service delivery, and responding to business and social needs in terms of faster turnaround time. I must commend the Malaysian government for having twin economic and government transformational programs driven by the Prime Minister's department through things like the Performance Management and Delivery Unit, the PEMANDO, that is pioneering efforts to re-engineer the system and processes within government, and PEMUDA, which is the facilitation unit, which actually accelerates the delivery of services. I was very impressed when Minister Kosu Kun told me that to get a passport in Malaysia, the time has been cut down from a month to a week to a day and now to an hour. I can tell you that is absolutely stunning to me. Global businesses today locate production where it makes sense and in terms of adding value. Because this equation has tremendous implications in terms of jobs, governments must understand how supply chains operate. This demands a more regional, technical, and structured dialogue between businesses and governments to help ensure alignment of policies with business realities. We need to collectively overcome this gulf of understanding in order that supply chains can operate efficiently and be a source of innovation and job creation wherever they operate. Specifically, the global supply chain demands far greater stability in regulatory principles and practices and clear adherence to rules-based operations. Markets and supply chains will move to those economies that demonstrate stability in rule of law and clear protection of property rights. Just as private sector supply chains need to be orchestrated for efficiency, stability, and sustainability, so too government services are also, in my mind, supply chains that need to be orchestrated between different levels to function in harmony. From the national perspective, economic policy today is really about plugging the domestic economy into the global trading system. SMEs need to be inserted into living, sustainable, and profitable global supply chains. Malaysia's national prosperity, in my mind, may depend very much on joining the local supply chains with the winning global supply chains around the world. This idea of having SMEs, having a specialty in a particular niche, and helping the SMEs plug in to global supply chains with their expertise in that particular niche. We must never forget that we live in a global network economy. Networks now compete against networks on a global basis, what I mentioned earlier. The future lies in strengthening our labor force through good education, favorable tax, and other incentives that fit the global supply chain, and having government services that support and nurture our supply chains to compete globally. If we don't exploit our comparative advantages, including strategic geographic location, the global supply chain simply moves to another location. The orchestration of government supply chains and business supply chains is complex, and it requires much greater national and regional cooperation to progress. We will also need to open up our minds to see things in a new light. Let me give you a for instance. Imports, in my mind, from our neighboring economies are not competition that we should fear. Rather, such imports are part of vital components and inputs that meld together the national and regional supply chains and make them stronger and more competitive. If you don't allow the components to flow freely, and by importing the vital components which you need in your global supply chain, you will not be able then to assemble the final supply chains to compete globally. And so the whole idea of excluding things by whole sector, the whole idea of import substitution, I think it's something that is now had its time. And we really need to look at the new environment and how the global supply chains work and actually fit into that environment. We need also to understand and measure trade flows in terms of value added, and most importantly in terms of jobs. If we understand where jobs and value added are being created in the global supply chain, we will begin to formulate policies, strategies, and business models very differently. This requires different expertise and different areas of cooperation between business and government, and could measure up, that these must measure up to the challenges of a fast-changing global economy. Remember I said earlier that the way the supply chains are flowing, the way they're constructed, really allocates the trade flows, the investment flows, and the jobs flow. And you must understand the movement to see how we can actually, in a sense, harmonize them with your local economy so you're really plugged in and be actually a part of this flow. And that I think is very, very important. To sum up then, viewing the world in terms of global supply chains and networks brings forth new perspectives of how to frame our own production, consumption, and distribution models. This new understanding will be critically important to meet one of the major challenges of the road ahead in Asia, and that of job creation. Our needs in this area are clear, particularly for countries like Malaysia that are having rising populations. This is a challenge not only of quantity, but of course, very important, also of quality. Job creation is best seen as a collaboration between policymakers and the business community. Business identifies its needs in terms of labor and skills along the supply chain. But governments has a key role in the supply of skilled labor and the training of the future workforce. Moreover, this is not a static game. It is a process and a balance that changes as the economy develops, as the global economy develops, and the global environment changes. We need to ensure that business and government are actively collaborating to make this happen. Now, as we move further into the 21st century, we are seeing that supply chains are becoming more influential, and we're able to understand the nexus between supply chains and job creation. At the same time, the links between job creation and people's sense of prosperity in the new economic landscape is also becoming a lot clearer. I believe that getting the nexus of supply chains, jobs, and prosperity right is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and one that deserves all our effort and attention. I will continue to study the issue with great interest and hope that you will also share your insights as we join hands to seek the best ways to serve our global community. Thank you once again to Khazanah for the wonderful hospitality, the chance to see so many friends in Kuala Lumpur, and this valuable forum for sharing my thoughts on global supply chains. I look forward to our continuing dialogue. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.